Okay, everyone, welcome back to the podcast. I'm joined once again by Dr. Michael Torre. And Dr. Torre, I have to say, our previous conversation was one of my all-time favorites. Really tremendous feedback all around on the predestination and permission of sin. And it's a topic that a lot of people struggle with. I think you offered some really great insights. I have to thank you personally as well for I'm thinking of nominating you for sainthood. The patience you have with responding to my own personal emails and my own my own research. You've been
well, Pat, if I may say so, there to interrupt you just in relation to yourself. It is true that we've had quite a lengthy back and forth on many issues, and I just want you to know that is not typical. I do occasionally engage in these kind of email exchanges, but relatively rarely. And if I have with you, it is because I find you're so thoughtful and persistent and careful. And it's clear to me that you are someone who really would like to understand this material and work at doing so, and have read quite a bit of things on it. In fact, it's very impressive to find someone like yourself who is not a doctoral student in philosophy, as far as I know. Nevertheless, I think clearly rising to the level of such a student or beyond even. And so it's a pleasure for me to have these interchanges with you, and I want you to know that I wouldn't do them except that I find you a very thoughtful and good partner to talk with.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, those are very kind words, deeply appreciated. And I want to make sure on this episode, I think this is going to be a fascinating episode. I'm really looking forward to this. We're going to talk about this wonderful book of yours that I've been recommending left and right to people. It's called What Is? Introductory Reflections on Thomistic Metaphysics. Now, I mentioned on a Facebook post that good introductory metaphysics books are somewhat hard to come by. For a while, I was recommending Father Norris Clark's One in the Many. Ed Fazer has a nice one on scholastic metaphysics, but it's probably a little thicker or more dense than I think a lot of people might want. But yours, Dr. Torre, I think just hits the absolute sweet spot between accessibility and rigor and just the topics that you treat. So for those who are interested in philosophy and metaphysics, if you don't even know what metaphysics is, stay tuned. We're going to explain that in a minute. I think you're going to get a lot out of this episode. I think you're going to find this really fascinating. But if you wouldn't mind, maybe take us back. What is the genesis of this book? My understanding is this started as a collection of lecture notes. Is that right?
That's correct. And I think that perhaps is the most important thing to say about the book. Its genesis does indicate its character. So to go back just a little bit, this came from a course that was at the University of San Francisco, which is a Jesuit university. And all Jesuit universities, in fact, most Catholic universities, in the earlier part of the 20th century, required that in the case of the USF, an all-male student body, but perhaps not in the case of others, but it required of the student body that as part of their general requirements that they take a series of courses in philosophy. That was part of the Jesuit formation, one might say, of undergraduates. And of course, Jesuit universities were known for a number of things, but one of the things they were known for was their good debate teams. And that was the result of this kind of formation, this intellectual formation, this logical formation. So they began with logic. They moved through a series of courses in looking at the world of nature, human beings as a part of that natural world, what seemed to be good for human beings individually and socially, therefore ethics and politics. And finally, then they had two courses, one in metaphysics and one in natural theology, in which they tried to reach up to the ultimate principles of reality and therefore the ultimate principle, which is God. So there was a series of courses that were taken by all students. They were all, in effect, required to minor, if you'd like, in Thomistic philosophy, and that really continued up to Vatican II. Mm-hmm. At the University of San Francisco after Vatican II, it was felt that was too heady and, a bit excessively apologetic and defensive. And so the requirements were cut to 4: logic, what got called human person, which involved nature, and ethics, and then the final course, which was called Being in God, and that course combined metaphysics and natural theology into one course. And then in 1976, at the University of San Francisco, the requirements got halved again. And so, of course, you can see if you had 4 classes in philosophy like that, that would still give you some kind of possible formation, or at least some kind of weight. You'd have had 4 classes. And at the University of San Francisco, at that time when they cut it to 2, a Great Books program was founded, the St. Ignatius Institute, which was well known by some people in American Catholic education. And one of the reasons why it continued, why it went into place, was that it wanted to continue those 4 classes in philosophy. But the general requirements were only 2. You had to take ethics, and then you had to take either, for a while, either what was called the man course, the human person, or the God course, Being in God. And when I became a member of the philosophy department full-time in the late 80s, I was assigned to teach that course, which was called Being in God. And so due to basically university politics and the change in the curriculum, what had been the 7th and 8th, or 6th and 7th in a series of courses, was now the first course that these poor students coming out of high school, having to fulfill their college requirement in philosophy, were assigned to take. I mean, that's to say, they were assigned to take, in effect, Aristotelian metaphysics, as, with absolutely no preparation. And I was assigned, this course, which had a number of texts and arguments and problems in it, that came out of that tradition of metaphysics. And after doing that for a year, I decided, well, this is unreasonable, the way it's been set up. These students have no preparation in philosophy at all. So I need to think, how can I manage to deliver this course fairly and in accord with the subject matter, which I did believe was what college level classes should do. They should read primary sources and think about these hard questions. But how could I do it in a way that the students themselves would not just be dispirited and throw up their hands and say, my God, what is all of this? So what I started to do was to give handouts to the students. For each class, maybe a 5-page handout, they would try to summarize or indicate the sort of thing that we were doing in the class. And so if you have 3 classes a week, that's maybe 15 pages a week. And if you have 15 weeks, then you're up to a total at the end of more than 200 pages of handouts, which is what I did. And I tried to shape the material for them in such a way that it would tell a story of some kind, that it would help them see kind of, if you'd like, what the cash value of this was, or what the take-home possibilities were for trying to think about these questions today. So I had these notes, and then after a year or 2, I realized, well, I can just put them all together and make that available to the students through the bookstore, and they can buy that as a text that they will then use alongside all of the other primary sources that we're going to be talking about. So that's what I did. And I thought it was just something to help that course. But there was one person who ended up being responsible for it being something more than that, and that is Mike Aquilina, who was somebody that I got to know in passing, really. But he asked me at one point, more or less maybe as you would have done 30 years later or 20 years later, whatever, when you started asking this question, is there any good introductory textbook in metaphysics? At which time, by the way, Norris Clark's one of the many was not available. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I don't know of any particular good one at the level you're talking about. I mean, I might have said something. I might have referenced He Who Is by Pascal or somebody. I don't really know what I said, to be honest with you. But I said, I have these notes. If you'd like, you can read them. And so I gave it to him, and he liked them. And so from that point on, which was in the early 90s, so almost 30 years ago, he said, this is really good stuff. You really should be proud of that. I said, well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I kept on giving that to the students in the class, and kept on trying to make the notes a little bit more coherent or a little more formally correct throughout the earlier part of the 90s. But by the end of the 90s, that course got discontinued. I think I wasn't especially opposed to that, even though it was a course that I was teaching, because in all honesty, it doesn't really make much sense to have an introductory course in philosophy be a course in Aristotelian metaphysics. So that text just simply stopped being relevant. It sat on my computer, and I would occasionally, in a sabbatical, go back and see what, and kind of just put it in a better form. And so about 4 years ago, I guess, Mike said, I think you should get that published. And I said, well, that's nice of you to say that. And he said, furthermore, I'll help you get it published. And I said, oh, well, somebody who might be interested in publishing this? Because frankly, I didn't think of it as a book to be published when I put those notes together. And he said, yeah, I do. So I said, well, okay, if you want to take it to a publisher, and if they think it's okay, I'm fine with having it published. So that's how it got published. But the reason why that genesis is relevant, I think, is that the book tries, or it tried anyway, to speak to an audience, speak to what I took to be roughly the kind of student at college who didn't have very much experience with philosophy, a mixed group of students, a few practicing Catholics, some non-practicing Catholic, number of non-Catholics. That's the way the student body was at the University of San Francisco in the 90s, and still is. So I had some experience with these students. And so knowing that, I tried to write a text that would manage to make this material provocative to them, that it would help them to think better about these matters. So what you said about trying to find that middle ground, that is what I was trying to do. And I'll just give you one example of this in relation to the book. It begins with, insofar as it really gets off the ground, it really begins with a discussion of skepticism.
Right.
And I did that because, in my view, that was the position of most of the students. They were skeptical that there was any sort of knowledge that could be called metaphysical, and any kind of conclusions that you could reach about these ultimate questions. They were skeptical about that, as they were skeptical about a great number of other things. They might not be skeptical in anything like a strong philosophical sense. It was just their own kind of background, semi-relativistic, quasi-skeptical view about these things with them. And so I did try then to help. So insofar as I took something on kind of hard, or tried to hit something with a number of arguments, I began with that because that I thought that would be an obstacle. If I couldn't get past that, then they'd be just constantly thinking, but, well, that's what you say, but, and they would never take it seriously. So it seemed very important to me to deal with this. And of course, their skepticism is the product of a number of forces in our culture, starting with the nominalism of Occam, working through the division of Western religious society into Protestant and Catholic, getting to get fairly skeptical views in modern philosophy and modern science, creating a situation where you can't return to this ancient wisdom. We have something new. So all of those things leading to the kind of zeitgeist that we have today, which I think is a little confused, is inclined to want to tolerate different opinions. That's what American society requires, and I think that's right. But then confuses toleration with everything being equally true, or
acceptance,
or we should think that everybody really knows, which I don't think is a coherent position. And I actually think when people look at skepticism hard, they realize, well, I'm not really a skeptic. Who wishes to be very self-critical or very critical of anything I accept, which is a perfectly reasonable philosophical position to take. But nevertheless, it gets confused with certain sloganistic mindsets, I think, in people. So I thought it was very important to begin there and to try to get students to see that, you know, they really weren't skeptics, and actually they really weren't relativists either.
Right.
Because that might free them up then to begin to ask, okay, well, what can I know about the world, you know, of a most general sort, the kind of basic questions that metaphysics tries to answer. They might be then open to that. So you see there then in this book, I think at its beginning, very much its genesis and kind of what it was trying to do, which was to speak to a set of students. And I dedicated the book to my students because, you know, I learned from trying to teach them, and I also learned what I thought was kind of most important to help them get into this material. And you'll see throughout the book that they're kind of all the time saying, well, you should go further into this, or further into this, or this is only being touched on so much. You know, the philosophy of science would deal with this, or philosophy of mind would deal with this. And, you know, I try to point them as we go towards, you know, things that require deeper reflection. Not trying to be, you know, tell everything, because I don't think that's possible.
Right.
So that's what you see then in this book.
Yeah. So yeah, fantastic. A lot of stuff there that I want to unpack with you. But I think you're right. You've got a great pulse on contemporary culture, especially regarding relativism and skepticism. And I want to spend some time talking on that. It seems to me then that there's a few things we need to do right out of the gate, if you will. One is clarify the metaphysical project. What is it? Why is it different than metamucil or the metaphysics people think of with like new age spirituality? There's just a lot of conceptual confusion on a popular level of what metaphysics actually is. And then two, to your point about skepticism, is validating it, validating the metaphysical project. Why is this something that we can engage in, and you know, what can it tell us about the world? So since you've been teaching this for a good number of years now, why don't you, Dr. Torre, tell us the best place to start? Where's our launching point here? Or there's one other thing I think it was it Maritain who said that if you're not a metaphysician, you're not a philosopher. I think that might be a Maritain quote. And if it's not, then we'll just throw it out there anyways. I'd wonder if you would agree with that. And if so, what do you think he means by it?
So I'll answer that question third. I'll answer the question you asked previously that second. But I'd like first to answer what you impliedly had asked, which is, how is this not like metamucil? Or it's not like, if you go into a bookstore today, you can find sections called metaphysics that actually have that word in some of these popular bookstores. So if you go there, you find things like tarot cards, you find things like mystical ways of, whether it's this Hindu guru or that Buddhist monk, or possibly even some Christian mystic. And you might find any number of things. Who knows what you would find? The abnormal, ghosts. So maybe it's worth noting then that the word meta means both after and above, and clearly it's above. That is what's behind that usage in the bookstore, and physics, of course, means nature. Aristotle's work, called Physica in Greek, gets translated as De Natura in Latin, from which we get, of course, in English, our nature. And of course, when people think about a study of nature, they're likely to think about physics, right? So if you have something that's above physics, right, that's above nature, right? Well, the word for above in in Latin is super. So it's like, you're dealing with something that's supernatural. Okay, so from that, you get all of these different things that you find in a bookstore.
Right.
All about the supernatural. Now, the great difference between that and the way in which the word is used in philosophy is that meta also means after. And in fact, there was no subject called metaphysics in, let's say, Plato. He called what gets called metaphysics dialectic. And in fact, he really thought of it as what philosophers do. And Aristotle even did not have that word. But he had a number of studies or chapters, or it's really a book that's not quite worked up for publication. It's sort of like what a professor might do if he had a number of different ideas and put them down, all of them related to a particular subject matter, but that he hadn't really quite got it to the step to publish it. And at his death, those were eventually organized by an editor. And he put all of those things after his discussions of physics. And so they got called metaphysics, came after physics. Okay. And so that tells you actually what the real difference is then between this work in philosophy and the way it gets used in bookstores. This is a study that insofar as it comes after physics is a rational undertaking in touch with the kind of questions we have about the physical world, the kind of questions that lead us to do physics, to think about the physical world. And in the case of Aristotle, when you think about the physical world, you're led to conclude from it that there is something that is the cause of the physical world and is above the physical world. It's not in the physical world, it's the cause of it. It's outside the universe, but it is, I use that word outside, metaphorically. It's not any place. It simply isn't an item in the universe. It's the reason for there being items at all. It's the cause of the universe, okay? And in fact, when you think about human knowing, human beings are beings in the natural world. They're physical beings, embodied beings, but they're mental. And when you think about mental activity, you're also led to the conclusion, according to Aristotle, that mental activity is not really reducible to physical activity, that it's a different kind of activity. We have sensory organs that are physical, and we can't see except we have an eye, or can't hear except we have an ear, but we don't have a physical organ of thought. And if you open up your cranium and look at your brain, you're not going to find any ideas in it, because ideas are of a different order. They're not, it's a mental order. And so naturally, in our own human talking, we speak about our interior life as opposed to our embodiment, or we go to a psychologist rather than a psychiatrist, because we don't have any, as far as we know, special, chemical deficiencies. It's not a drug that we need. It's somebody talking to us about our inner life. Or you have books like The Inner Life of Childhood, or whatever it may be. So this inner outer metaphor, it's quite common, and it's indicating that there is this kind of reality, our mental reality, that actually is not reducible to the physical. Anyway, that's what Aristotle thought. So Aristotle thinks that when you look at the natural world and you look at the human knowing of that natural world, you're led to conclude that there is more to reality than just the physical. And so, you're naturally then led to ask a question about anything that exists, whether it's physical or not physical, right? And in fact, even before you know that there is it seems anyway, from his point of view, that there is something other than the physical. Even before you know that, you're still interested in everything that exists. You're simply interested in wanting to know that he begins his metaphysics with the classic statement, all human beings desire to know, right? And that's distinctive to us. We want to know, and we want to know the truth, and we want to know the truth about reality. But we want to know what is the case. Don't fool me. Come on, doc, tell me, do I have cancer? We want to know, even if it's painful. And that desire reaches up to whatever is. So we want, and of course, as a consequence of that, we want to know what life's all about. Where'd we come from? Where are we headed? Can we answer these questions? Is there some hope for something beyond death? Those questions are human questions. They are questions that, of course, every religion deals with, and deals with it usually according to a certain way of talking. It deals with it often by stories or parables. And of course, that's because human beings are interested in these things, and that's one of the ways that we do learn and understand through those things. But philosophy always has been a very rational undertaking, a very logically minded undertaking. And so it's interested in these questions, but it's only interested in these questions insofar as the evidence of things that we are immediately aware of would lead us to certain conclusions, right? And so it's not relying upon stories. It's not relying upon this or that religious tradition. It's simply trying to take a look at what is the case. And from that, it reaches up towards things that actually go beyond the physical, okay? So it's after the physical, but it goes beyond it. Now, in the bookstore aren't after the physical. They just take off like a rocket up into outer space and tell you all sorts of things, all of which don't have any obvious bearing upon physics or connection to ordinary things that we would do in physics or mathematics. But not true of this discipline, which is a philosophical discipline. And in Plato's Republic, he has this famous simile of the divided line. And he talks about different ways of knowing, which begin with stories and then move through the imagination to physical realities, and from physical realities to mathematical concepts. And then finally, he says, we try to get clear about the first principles of all of our reasoning. And we try to actually have this kind of inverted way of defending everything we've been doing, because we can see that actually, in order to advance in these things, we have to lay certain things down as true. But of course, we can turn around and look at those things and ask, well, is there any reason why we should make those claims? So a physicist, for example, might say, well, you can't do physics unless you suppose that, we have some sensory evidence that's reliable. So we're assuming that in our undertaking here. But somebody might say, well, why should I assume that? And Plato sees we can ask that question. And there have been previous skeptics who indeed had asked that question or who had posed that. And so he sees that the range of human asking of questions and of seeking answers requires that we hit these fundamental principles. And that's exactly then what Aristotle does also in what gets to be called metaphysics, his metaphysics. It's taking a look at these very first principles of all of our thinking, of all of our discourse, of any science, because it's interested precisely in these things, these ultimate principles of things that exist, the ultimate explanation or causes for why things exist. That's the kind of thing that goes on in this study. And I can see why then Maritain would say, and I think I even say at some point in the book, that you can talk about moral philosophy, you can talk about natural philosophy, but if you just talk about philosophy without any kind of qualification, then what you think of is, the philosopher is the person who's going to kind of give the ultimate account, is going to explain first principles, going to drive everything back to certain and clear things that we all hold or we all should hold. So it's actually a study then that looks at everything.
Right. Right.
So I again say at one point in my book, well, if you look at dogs, there's a whole bunch of things you can say. But then if you look at mammals, of which dogs are only one instance, there are fewer things that will hold true, because there's some things that are not true of cats, but they're mammals. So the kind of truths that we can reach about all mammals are fewer than the kind of truths that we could reach about all dogs. But although there are fewer truths, they extend further, because they extend to all mammals, whereas our discussion of dogs only extends to dogs. So then you can go from mammals to animals, and go from animals to living things. At each level of discourse, you're widening the number of items covered, and you're also narrowing the number of things that can be said about all the items. When you finally get to whatever exists, you've gotten to the widest possible scope of asking of that question, and then so you're going to have the fewest things you can say, but you're also going to have things that then refer to anything. And so that actually is what metaphysics is about. It's about asking those really ultimate questions. And it's about reflecting back upon what will turn out to be first principles and finding a way to defend what is immediately obvious to us.
Yeah, that's a wonderful explanation. So I suppose at this point, then, now that we've clarified what the metaphysical project is about, is maybe to turn toward its validation, and also its you mentioned this earlier, its value. Like what could we possibly stand to gain from engaging in metaphysics? A common thing that you often hear, especially in our culture, even by otherwise brilliant men, the late Stephen Hawking comes to mind, who said philosophy is dead, right? And of course he meant metaphysics with that, and they give this impression that whatever questions there are left to be answered, the natural science is going to answer them at some point. It's gonna figure this stuff out. So why are we still trying to dust the cobwebs off of these old philosophical projects here? So what would be your general response to this sort of, to the attitude of scientism as it's come to be known? Mm-hmm.
Right. At universities across the land, there are courses offered in the philosophy of science by philosophers of various kinds. You will not be reading Stephen Hawking in that course, okay? All of these scientists, right, who then are popularizing scientists, what science has, simply beg the question. They simply begin by saying, well, of course science is true. Now you could say, well, why should I accept that? Now, that's a perfectly legitimate question to ask, just as it's a perfectly legitimate question to ask, well, what are the limits of science? Or what do the methods of science indicate are its limits? All of those questions are exactly appropriate for philosophy of science. And those are all the kind of questions these people don't ask. They just dogmatically affirm something, okay? And you know, that's not a very interesting philosophical position. I can dogmatically affirm any number of things. You know, you have to agree with me. I like science. What they do is they assume science is right. And then having assumed science is right, then they do their metaphysics. Well, you can't do that, okay? And no good philosopher of science would allow it. So, you know, Sagan may be nice as a popularizer. And these people can be very, very smart, okay? But they've done what a lot of very smart people do. They assume that they're smart in one area and therefore they're smart in other areas. This is a problem that goes back to Socrates. You know, I have a colleague who said about advertisements that you could deflate all of them with two questions, or virtually all of them. Prove it, and so what? Because either they can't prove what they're saying, or what they're saying is really not on point. You know, it's very nice that somebody's a good actor or a good actress, But whatever made that actor or actress think that they could come before Congress and tell people how they should conduct a war? I mean, being an actor, or being a good chemist gives you absolutely no standing whatsoever to do that. But nevertheless, there are people who think that, gee, I'm smart and intelligent and people pay attention to me, so I get to talk about things I don't know anything about. And the truth of the matter is that a lot of these popularizers do that. So I'm not talking about my philosophy here. I'm just talking about any philosophy department in the country. They understand that there are a set of questions that you have reason to ask. What is the value of empirical science? What are its methods? What are its limits? What can be known about it? Okay. Now there is, in addition to that, a philosophical position, which is called positivism. Okay, and positivism was a position in the 20th century, which actually is articulating philosophically some of the prejudices of these scientifically minded people. And so, for example, it was asserted that if something could not be verified, it wasn't a meaningful statement. The only statements that really deserve to be taken seriously as possibly true or false were ones that could be verified scientifically. Okay. But the trouble with that is that statement, it was very quickly seen what the trouble with that statement can't be verified.
Right.
That statement is not a scientific statement. You can do physics, but when you say physics is the only science, you're not doing physics. Okay. And so when you decide to say that, we have every right to say, well, why? And don't bring in physics, because this isn't physics. Okay? Tell me why it is that what you've just said is true. Okay. And there, all of these people, if you really ask that question hard and do not run away from it, don't have an answer to that.
Right. Mm-hmm.
They're just assuming something, but they don't have a right to assume that. Okay. So this is something that you would think after 100 years of making this point, because this point has been made against scientism, which has been around since the late 19th century, that people would kind of wake up and say, maybe this is, overextending what we can know about science. It does go back, I believe, to a cultural tendency, which was very strong in the late 19th century. And actually, it did have a lot of impact on Jacques Maritain, since you mentioned him. In that time, there was this sense that, well, in our earliest beginnings, we were all into magic and things just happened, and nature was completely unpredictable, and it was the gods that did it. And then we became a little more sophisticated, became religious, but finally we now have become rational and scientific because there were all these wonderful discoveries that were being made in the 19th century. And so, we've grown up and we don't need to pay attention to any of that anymore. And science simply places whatever went for answers previously. Everything's going to be rational and scientific. And we were going to explain thought, and we were going to explain everything in terms of science. And you can still find philosophers who do believe this and who still do try to do this. But philosophers have become more sophisticated. I mean, they've realized, well, that's a cultural tendency, and understandable perhaps given the growth in science, but it deserves to be reflected upon. And is it really true? And when you start to ask that question, then you realize that actually we need to go back and think hard about, well, what truth is, what the standards for truth are, what are the bases for doing this science, what are the bases for all thought, how do we think, all these hard questions, right? You're going to have to engage logic, you're going to have to engage these questions that end up by being metaphysical questions. You can't just assume dogmatically that you have the answer for everything if you want to be a philosopher, because the one philosophy is not, it's dogmatic. It is, despite what the skeptics think, it does not lay down truths, that it just simply says, well, you have to believe that even though there's no good reason. It always seeks, and has ever sought as a discipline, to give an account, to reflect upon our life and to give a reason why. That's always what philosophy does. So it's perfectly okay to say something like, when we reflect upon the givens of our senses and the things we first know, we reach the conclusion that they're self-explanatory and that there's no reason to bring in something beyond the physical. So you can take that position. That's a philosophical position, okay? That's not what these scientific types do. They're popularizing dogmatically what they assume to be true. But you can take a philosophical position that would in effect defend what they're holding. It's just what the book argues is that's a mistaken conclusion.
Right. Yeah, and I want to get into that, but I think thank you for that treatment. I think it's something we do have to battle against, because people who are regarded as great intellectuals, and in many respects rightfully so. I don't think anyone wants to deny that Stephen Hawking was surely a brilliant man in his area if he did make some serious blunders when he stepped outside of that. But yeah, it seems to me, and I'd be curious if you agree with this, that scientism is either obviously false or massively uninteresting. And in the sense that it assumes that the restricted domain of science is the end all be all, when it clearly assumes certain aspects of human thought and reality that it cannot itself justify. Things like logic, mathematics, the reality of the external world, the reliability of our senses. So that's going to be a problem, right? That I think would show that science can't tell us everything about everything. Or the other thing that I've seen people do is just extend the definition of science and say, oh, well, science covers all that. And that's what I guess I would say, well, then that's just uninteresting. You're just using science in the way that I guess we would be using philosophy then. Right?
Well, okay. So my response to that would be slightly, I guess would be this. Let's just bracket the second. And come back to the first, which I think is the more important issue. What I would say is, it's not that scientism is, obviously false. I would rather say this: if the kind of attitude the scientific person takes is true and defensible, that's because there is a philosophy, a naturalistic philosophy, that argues correctly, it thinks, that you don't have to go further than the physical realities that we encounter in order to give an account of what we've encountered. There is no reason to go beyond those things, okay? So you've got a naturalism, or you have a version of that which says, all we can know is of that kind, and although there might be something beyond it, it's beyond our knowing, okay? So in any case, if there is something valuable in scientism, it lies in the value of that philosophy. It lies in that kind of naturalistic position, which is one that has been taken by a number of perfectly good philosophers. So I don't mean to put down Stephen Hawking, and I picked up that you were making sure I gave him his due. Yeah, I don't want to. Anyway.
Yeah, no, and I didn't think you were at all. Yeah, right. Yeah.
I don't want to deny Stephen Hawking, a brilliant fellow, but I suggest he wasn't a philosopher. But I do think that even within philosophy, the kind of position that Stephen Hawking likes is a defensible position within philosophy.
Right. So maybe
I would order us to that. Okay. I would say, look, well, then look at this philosophical account. And I think that then what the book suggests is when you try to do that and do look at that philosophically, the conclusion that it's self-explanatory is false. It doesn't bear scrutiny.
Yeah.
Philosophers have been divided on this question for millennia. There were those such as Plato and Aristotle who took the position I'm taking. The Hellenistic philosophers, like the Epicureans and the Stoics, didn't want to take that position. They wanted to confine themselves to the natural world. All things were corporeal. That's all that they were going to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
In the modern world, reacting against the medieval endorsement of Plato and Aristotle, you get a lot of moderns who say, well, we really can't know anything about that. And part of Kant's project is, as a modern philosopher, to say that there is something beyond that, but we can't know it according to the categories that we use to talk about physical things. And so you can find certainly philosophers who take a naturalistic position. So I wouldn't want to say, well, it's obviously false and just dismiss it. I would want to say, well, let's not do scientism.
Yeah.
Let's do the philosophy.
And I just want to.
And I don't think it stands up. I think, okay, if someone will concede that, then let's have the argument. And I just think, well, when you have the argument, you see that Plato and Aristotle are right on that point.
Right. So let me clarify what I said. I would say you're absolutely right. Right. That if it's justified, it's going to have to be justified philosophically, which I guess is kind of what I was getting at. So to me, and correct me if I'm off on this, but positivism was a lot about meaning, where scientism is really about epistemology, the order of knowing. So I guess on the popular level of like the strong form scientism, that if it doesn't come to us through the hypothetico-deductive method, we can't know it. That seems obviously false to me because it doesn't meet its own standard. But to your point, which is obviously right, there are different schools of scientism. I think there's like 5 different schools of scientism. Last I did the research on it, and you have across the board. You have somebody like I guess like an Alex Rosenberg, who's a deeply committed naturalist, who would say the physical facts fix all the facts, and he goes all the way of saying there's no meaning. Even in his book, he says there's no meaning to any of the sentences. There's no truth. There's no morality. There's no mind. But at least he's making so he would defend scientism, but he's doing it, it seems, largely from at least a philosophical perspective. I think it's a very interesting philosophical perspective, but I think is that more to your point then? Because then we really have just come into the realm of philosophy, and that's where it needs to be properly settled, right?
I guess all I was trying to say, Pat, is that we have to distinguish between popularizations of something and a philosophical account. And I think it is fair, I just did it, to say, sometimes those who give popularizing accounts don't quite understand themselves. I mean, they think they're doing the same thing the philosophers are doing, and I don't think that's true. And I do think, as you say, that in relation to some of this is dismissible, or you can quickly see that it's either begging the question, or it's dogmatically asserting something, or it's actually very questionable. So, I mean, to take the case of if you want to take one particular instance, right, you have to have a certain method, and the only method that counts is the method that we use in empirical science, okay? And you can show that when somebody says that, that's not a conclusion of empirical science. So they clearly, if they're going to be in any way not self-refuting, have in some sense already recognized, well, there is something. There is a meta language, they'd probably say, that that's not science, but it's all in defense of science. If somebody were to say that, I do think that the ordinary student deserves to have a question put to them, which is one of the questions that I do put in the very beginning of the text. Well, how do you know your friend? You think you have a friend, I assume, or at least did or might. And you think
you're lucky you might have 2, yeah.
yeah, and you think well, okay, then you got your father, your mother, your brother, your sister again. Or if you're in an orphanage, some of the other orphans. I mean, some, but we're social. We know people. Mm-hmm. And certainly we say, well, I don't know so-and-so. So I couldn't help you there. But, oh, yeah, well, Judy, blah, 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 and off you go. So we think we know things about the people that we come into contact with. And we don't think that that's idle and foolish and just made up or dogmatic. No, so it's based upon something, okay? But is it based upon the hypodeductive method? No, I don't think it is. When people start asking themselves, what the range is of the things that they know, I think they can rather quickly see that, that they know they exist is not based upon a deductive method, but they're sure they exist. And they haven't figured science out, but my cat died, and it's not based upon some method. I think they can be disabused of thinking that they only know one way. But they might come back to a more reasonable position, which is that, well, if you're going to assert that something is true publicly, and that there's evidence that something is clearly the conclusion of reason, a rational undertaking, then you're going to end up by getting limited to this kind of method and this kind of science. And that's the standard for knowing about matters of fact. I mean, say there's a standard for mathematics, but it's not knowing about matters of fact. So they could try, and there are plenty of people who do, to defend a naturalistic account that would be in harmony with, or that would in some sense be defending what a so-called scientific person might be inclined towards. So I don't want to denigrate any of that. I mean, it seems to me that, yeah, there are thinkers who do attempt to do this, and they do have arguments. And those arguments are taken seriously by other philosophers who do seek to then come to terms with them and reply to them. I mean, you mentioned in passing Phaser, right? Well, he's always doing this, right? I mean, he's taking all of this analytic philosophy or naturalism seriously, right? And trying to argue against it. And I think that's perfectly reasonable within the philosophical undertaking. So behind this, what I would consider to be slightly naive and slightly dogmatic position of the scientific person, behind that lies possibly at least you could say a defensible view, in the sense that at least has reasons and is trying to give reasons for why that is true. I just don't think it's actually successful. I think that this position, whether it's of the Stoics or whether it's of Kant or whether it's of these particular philosophers today who will try to do this, are mistaken. Mm-hmm. I think that when you look at reality and you look at physical things, you are led naturally and rightly to affirm there must be something other than this kind of thing.
And that seems to accord.
It's not self-explanatory.
Right, and that seems to accord well even with, and I'm not a psychologist, I don't like to pretend to be one, but I have heard about some of the recent research of even in child psychology that they sort of just naturally developed to see the world as organized, teleological, right? They're sort of mini metaphysicians of, I guess, an Aristotelian order of sort. And this is something that they, apparently you've seen even in kids that are brought up in an atheistic household. It's this sort of occasioning in them of this, I guess, the sort of metaphysical intuitions that I think both of us would want to say are at least generally reliable. Now, of course, the naturalist might just come back and say, well, that's just something that's been fobbed off through the evolutionary process. It doesn't hint at anything. So I'm acknowledging that you can go back and forth on stuff like that, but it's at least, I think, something that's worth pointing out. I'm not sure if you want to add anything to that, but I think it would. Well,
let me come in there, okay? Because what you're reverting to is basically a philosophical position known as mechanism, right? This position, which was first clearly enunciated in any sophisticated way by Epicurus, then becomes quite, it's picked up on by people who think that the world can be understood in mathematical terms and causes that function mechanistically. Okay, so mechanism is a philosophical position. It was one that was put forth at the advent of modern science in the 17th century. It's still around. And that position wants to say that when you talk about things acting for ends, that you're mistaken and you shouldn't do so. That end-directed activity is actually, in some sense, an illusion. Everything really doesn't act for ends. It acts mechanistically. So everything acts the way, you might think a ball hitting another ball acts. It's not for an end. It's just by virtue of what the ball is. It's got a force to it, and it knocks into another thing, and that other thing acts a certain way. So in other words, all of the explanation for physical reality is going to be reducible to necessity. It's the necessity of this kind of mechanistic interaction. Okay, so you referenced evolution, and there are some people who think that modern science, and especially evolutionary theory, gets rid of final causes. Okay, it's all mechanistic. I just don't think that's true. I don't think they've looked very carefully at what they're saying. I mean, for example, quite typically, you get people who will say that, well, animals seek to survive, and this environmental whatever, or this sunburst or whatever kind of thing you want, aids them in their survival, and that's why that particular subspecies went on to pass on its genes, right? But they sort of fail to notice that when they say, that the animal seeks to survive, that's actually a teleological statement, right? They don't recognize fully that their language is full of teleology, right? But when they think, well, what's the function of the kidney, right, in the body? They don't have any trouble at all talking that way, okay? What's the function of the heart? That's teleological language, teleological argument. That's saying, well, when we say we can build a artificial heart, right? It's not made up of the stuff that hearts are made up of. It's made up of some other heart, something else, right? And it'll do the job of a heart. Well, the reason why we can do that is because we know what it's for. We know the kind of thing it is seeking to accomplish in the body. That's all end talk. That's all speaking about things in relation to, what they are ordered to. Heart is ordered to pumping blood. A kidney is ordered to straining impurities of the urine. All these things are ordered to some particular task that is theirs, okay? And that is to talk teleologically. Animals are ordered to living, seeking to live. And they don't just seek to live, they seek to sense. Everything that is acts in accordance with what it is. and they don't understand that kind of language is teleological language.
Right.
And that they don't understand that, I think, is just because they really haven't worked real hard at being a philosopher.
Yeah.
Aristotle said this way back in his physics, right? That if you take a look at things materially, yes, things act mechanistically or necessarily. If it rains on iron, iron rusts. It's the nature of iron to do that. It's going to do that if it's going to react that way. Okay, so there's kind of a necessitarian point of view. But all nature not only is made of stuff, but it's organized a certain way. The stuff is organized to do X, whatever X is. And that's the talk about its formal cause. That's the talk about what it is. That's the talk about the way the matter is organized. And it's organized to do X. And that's teleological talk. And I don't think they've quite grasped that.
Mm-hmm.
They think that they can evacuate all of that talk from science. I don't think they understand what they're saying they can evacuate, because they don't.
Right.
The biologist, and what you end up having often with these people actually is you get teleology. It's now teleology of matter. It's like the brain is thinking, or it's, you end up by having, all of these brilliant things that nature does. It's like nature's thinking about those things, right? I mean, they haven't bothered to ask themselves whether that really is true. I mean, you can see this in somebody like Freud, for example. He's got this little sensor, right, who's busy censoring things. Well, this is mythical talk. He doesn't actually think there is some censor there, right? I got to look at what you're doing. No, it's just he can't help himself. The way in which you're going to analyze this is inevitably going to bring that in. Mm-hmm. If that's true, it's because there's a first principle there, which they really can't avoid, which is that agents act in accordance to what they are. And therefore every agent acts for a determinate X. And that is to say, every agent acts for an end. It's a principle that is embedded in the way they're thinking. They just haven't been able to explicate that, okay? That they haven't been able, because actually to dig down to principles and ask yourself, well, what's implied in a principle, and really explicate it and say, oh, see, yeah, wow, that's hard to do.
Yeah. Yeah, this is
what Aristotle does. The reason why Aristotle is a certain kind of naturalist is sees that nature is analogous to human mind. You know, we have ends in our mind, and they exist in our mind, and then we try to bring them about, to execute things to bring about the end that's in our mind, right? And that's what's directing all our activity, and that's why we make the thing that we make in order to make a plate, in order to make a computer, in order to, whatever it is that we have in mind. Okay, but it exists in our mind, and that's what's directing the activity that we're engaged in. And when he looks at nature, he says, oh, it's like that. It's like the spider has mind. It's like the spider says to itself, well, I need to get flies, being a spider. How am I going to do that? Oh, I know what I'll do. I'll make a web. Well, how do I make a web? Well, I go this, and okay, well, that's what I'll do. Then I'll set. It's like that. There's an analogy to the way we act in nature. So he's all for looking at nature, and what he's always saying is, wow, you know, wow, look at the mind that's at work here. You know, what has happened with a lot of modern science actually is they make that wow even more wow, because they're just, you know, really struck by how brilliant everything is, right?
Right.
But they've got a dogmatic position that says somehow that's got to that brilliance, all of that order, that can't possibly come from ordering cause. That is, unfortunately, I think, an error on their part, right? And they don't need it in order to have their, you know, they can do evolutionary theory. They can look at everything they want to look at. They can find all of the necessary causes that exist in the world that they do find. They can be reluctant to introduce final causality where there's no need for it. They can be good scientists. And I think, you know, that's great. But you don't have to draw the conclusion that so many of them suppose, or it's not even a conclusion they draw. You don't have to have that supposition. A lot of these people think you have to suppose something in order to do science that you don't have to suppose.
Right.
So you find a number of, not all scientists, but you find some scientists who think, well, you know, you're not being scientific unless you agree with this supposition. And that turns out, I think, simply not to be defensible.
Yeah.
That if you look at science, you can say, well, where did you get off saying that? I mean, you know, let's do science. That's great. But why do you have to have that supposition? You don't. You just dogmatically have it because people in your family who came from another family who kind of lost their religious feelings about there being a God or something, have handed on to you the view that there is. You've grown up without any such thing. And you've sort of assumed that reason is going to justify your position. But I think it's an assumption that actually is not borne out by good thinking.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm glad you brought this up because I wanted to talk to you about causation anyway. So this is sort of a good transition to that. Just two things I would like to get your opinion on. One is teleology seems inescapable, at least on some levels. And once you realize that, you might as well just affirm it everywhere else. I mean, even with reason, right? Like it seems like reason is really pointed at attaining truth. And if we deny that, it then seems like we have no standard for reasoning, and then we can't say whether somebody's reasoning well or poorly. And then we have no standard for arguments. And then, well, what arguments do you have against final causes, right? It just seems like it quickly kind of collapses into nonsense. And if we have at least teleology in the order of reason, why then just sort of arbitrarily cut it off elsewhere when it seems so obviously the case? And your point about science is a good one. And since we mentioned Phaser a few times, one of his analogies has always stuck with me. He says something like this. You know, I'd be curious your thoughts on this as well, Dr. Torre. Is that you know, if you have a sort of method, right, that's really good at capturing certain aspects of reality. Say you're a physicist and you can capture certain aspects of reality in the language of mathematics. It's then something of a howling non sequitur to just assume that anything it doesn't capture doesn't exist. It's like going around with a metal detector and you don't find plastic with that metal detector, but then inferring that there's no such thing as plastic, right? Just because you have a powerful tool for investigating one aspect of reality, what gives you the license to then just to say that is the only that is the only thing that's actually real? And it sounds like
I think Yeah, there is no license, and I think you're absolutely right. And again, that's exactly what the philosophy of science does, right? The philosophy of science says, what's the method of empirical science? What are the limits of the method? And of course, then should we assume that the limits of that method are absolute, so that's the only thing we can say? Obviously, one could argue, no, there's limits of that science, but that doesn't mean it's limits of all reality. And that's why I said, I think, you know your friend, and you know you exist, all sorts of things in a way that's not in accordance with the method of empirical science. I think that, yeah, but I do also want to give these people some credit here. I think that they're so impressed with what science has done, and so impressed with the public nature of it. They're so impressed with the unanimity that it is capable of cross-culturally, cross-time, the way it grows. They're just so impressed with this that they, perhaps not too surprisingly, have that be their fundamental standard. That anything that is less than this will be, less defensible, or that. So I could see how they would, someone with this position might easily enough say, well, yeah, there are other ways of knowing, and yeah, I can't just suppose this is the only way. But nevertheless, this is the privileged way when it comes to asserting publicly that are true and evident, and so I'm going to stick with this, and so I get that. I again think if you look at it philosophically, you're going to have to say a lot more than that, and I think you're going to have to shake them loose from that. But I sort of see why they want to hold on to it or tenaciously try to defend this view. I think it's because they have this love of the kind of things that science gives us, and they have this love of reason. But to return to your point about teleology, yes, of course, it's most obvious in human activity, right? I mean, we have purposes, we have ends and goals. So often one of the things that you find happening is they say, well, you're being anthropomorphic. You're extending, what's true with us to things that aren't true of us. But I think that it's, again, not merely the case with us and our desire to know the truth, but it's quite obviously the case with living things, which is why the little kid sees this, right? And it's why you get cartoons with the little kid looking out at the world, he's this atheist saying, there's just too damn much order here, right? I mean, so yeah, there's this kind of, I think in relation to living things, right, that they do clearly unfold towards the mature term of their development. They clearly do act to build nests and webs and do the kind of things that animals do, and that seeds, their roots down into the soil and draw up water. Again, all of the people that talk that way, they're going to talk teleologically.
Right.
Why? It's seeking water, right? Notice it's seeking. You're not going to get rid of that kind of analogical talk. Yeah, that's exactly what it's doing, right? And that's, it's opening up to the sun. Notice the talk again. So the reason why Aristotle is so obviously teleological in his thinking is because when he's looking at nature, he's first looking at sensitive and living things, and it's obvious there. And then he tries to see how it could also be true for non-living things, right? They have a natural place or something. If you start the other way around, if you start with the non-living, actually, you might wonder about that, right? Because non-living things don't develop. They're not alive. They don't engage in any kind of internal action. That's exactly what living things do, but non-living things don't. And so if you start with non-living things, then you might be inclined to build back up a non-teleological explanation into somehow the living things, which I think is exactly what the mechanistic person wants to do. But I think that if you look even at non-living things, that you're going to reach the same conclusion if you think carefully, because nitro is by its nature ordered to blow up, comes into contact with glycerin and a certain amount of force. So what you find with elements and non-living material is that by nature okay, by virtue of what they are ordered to react to a certain kind of force or a certain kind of external agent in a determinate way. They are going to act to produce. This is teleological language, okay? But you don't perhaps see that initially, right? I mean, so the example that Aristotle gives is that fire goes up, right? That it's by nature it goes up. Well, that kind of explanation, now we might say, well, that if you put it in a place that doesn't have gravity or something, I mean, all this stuff changes. So this kind of referencing the natural place of something, which is what he does with non-living things, today kind of might be regarded as, well, that's not really true. It's harder, and let's admit it, it's harder to find teleological language in non-living things. But surely the reason why the child, thinking of his world, reaches teleological conclusions is precisely because he's looking at living things. He's looking at his cat, his dog, he's looking at all those, and that's all teleological. And I fail to see how you really get away from that. There are some people who think that you can kind of do biology according to mathematics and somehow avoid teleological language. I think they're completely mistaken about that.
Right. Yeah.
Watch what they say. They say, whoops. And I think actually that whoops, that's going to come in with physics too. If you don't come into mathematics, mathematics doesn't have ends. As Aristotle said long ago, there's no good in mathematics. It's just formal relations. They're not desiring anything. Okay, right. So mathematics is something that does not have final causality in it, but physical things, they do. And I think that that's true even of the non-living. But I would concede someone could legitimately ask about a non-living thing. Well, how is that teleological? What we do see about non-living things, the degree to which it is material and necessitated, and that argument is what's often made, right? That's exactly what we do in our sciences, and that's okay. But I do think you're going to find that you can't do without it.
Yeah, that reminds me, if I can find the paper, I'll try to link to it, but I think it was it Dr. Delfino? He did contemporary formulation of Aquinas' fifth way based off of just an electron. An electron has a sort of natural inclination to be attracted to proton, for example. So his argument was you can start with is something and granted that there's great debate in philosophy of science of the relation to the micro to the macro and all that, but his point was you can find teleology there, and even from that example, we can still launch into a teleological argument. Aquinas is the fifth way.
Let me give you something that I think actually might well be of some help here. In Aristotle's account, which we haven't gotten to yet because we haven't gotten to God, but in Aristotle's account, there has to be an agent that accounts for change, right? The change is an actualization, and things are only actualized by other things that are actual. So the water only becomes hot by virtue of some flame, right? The pot is hot, and the pot is hot because the burner is hot, right? This is the way we think about change. It's going to require some kind of agent, okay? But then you can, okay, so fine. Now we've got an agent. We got to have an agent. But you can ask about the agent, right? Well, why does the agent act, right? And you recognize when you ask that question, oh, yeah, it must also be the case in order to explain agency fully, right? That the agent is the kind of thing determined to act this way rather than that way, okay? That every agent is going to be the agent of X and not non-X, right? It's going to do X, whatever it is that agent is. It's not going to do the opposite, okay? The agent is therefore pre-ordered, we might say, or is already set up to, when it acts, bring about X, okay? All you're doing is looking at the agent itself and what is the necessary condition for there to be an agent, right? Well, the agent, if the agent were undetermined, if the agent could be the agent of A, B, C, D, E, all these infinite possibilities, okay, equally, well, they wouldn't act. There's nothing in the agent that accounts for why it is an agent, right? Or why it is an agent of X, right? It is an agent of X because it's the kind of thing that it is, and it's the kind of thing that it is, meaning it's predetermined to bring about this rather than that. This is an analysis of agency, okay? And when you analyze the agency, you're doing kind of the same thing that Aristotle does to get to the agent in the first place. It's like, well, if we're going to have this thing changing, then inevitably there has to be this X, that's accounting for it. Okay. Do I have to stop there? No, I have to then ask about that X. Okay. Well, okay, now it's going to do this. Well, was it set up to do this? Is there something in the agent that sets it up to do that rather than that? And the answer, of course, is, yeah, it has to be. Or if it doesn't have that determination within it, it won't act, right? It'll be like Buridan's ass. It'll be stuck between of hay at equidistant. Not that the ass would know that, but if it did, it's sort of like, okay, well, I don't know what to take because they're all equally good, and so I'm indeterminate to act. I'm just going to stick here indefinitely and die. I mean, I don't think it's a very good argument about the ass, but nevertheless, you get the image, right?
Right.
It's not determined towards anything. What final causality is that the agent itself has within itself a determination to act one way rather than another way. Mm-hmm. Just the same thing as saying that every agent acts for an end. That's what it means to say every agent acts for an end. Okay, so part of this argument, I think, requires that we, kind of stop imagining things and get clear about, well, what is the philosophical import of the principle? What's it really saying? And I think that when you get there, then you do get to a place that's sort of less threatening to the people who are somehow thinking final causality is no good. I mean, they get to where you got, right? You get to, well, an electron is by its very nature ordered to, just stuck that in. I said ordered to, whoa, that's final causality, right? It's ordered to do X when it comes into relation with a proton, right? Whenever you've got the language of ordered to, you've got final causality. Mm-hmm. And the point is, you can't get rid of that order to. It's inbuilt into the way we think about causes. That's why for somebody like Aquinas, it's a principle. That is, principles are things that are evident, and in fact necessary and unavoidable. Mm-hmm. And saying you can't avoid this. You cannot avoid language of ordered to, and so you can't avoid bringing in what gets called to be final causality. And so actually one of the ways I think, and Yves Simon would be very good at this, one of the ways of getting final causality a better hearing is to try to re-speak it. Okay, if you can say it in a way that's exactly what that is saying, but you can say it, in somehow differently, then somebody's likely to say, oh, is that what you mean?
Right.
Well, yeah, that's all I mean. Oh, okay. Well, if that's all you mean, well, that seems all right. I thought you were saying it had to, no, I'm not saying that. Okay, I'm just saying this. Oh, well, that's interesting. I'll have to think about that. Okay, and I think that's the kind of conversation maybe you could have. But we've gotten so into this, anti-final cause mode in the mind of some scientists that you have to kind of find a way to talk to get them out of that.
I agree.
Tendency because I think that I don't think it's really got anything to do with what they're doing, but they think it does, and I think that you have to work at that. I mean, that's all of this work, which this book does not do, is the work that I do think Thomistic philosophy could do. Mm-hmm. I think that having a deep, developed metaphysical account of physical reality, that is to say, to do, in effect, natural philosophy, and to show that you can do that perfectly well in relation to contemporary empirical science, that's the crucial thing that the Thomist philosophers need to do. Because when you can do that, then you overcome this tragic divide that occurred in the 17th century between a philosophical account of the natural world and an empirical scientific account, as though they're opposed to each other, and they're not opposed to each other. And that's an error, okay? But it's so rooted in a certain kind of cultural tendency that you have to work very, very hard to show that that is not so.
Yes.
And I do think that would be, to do that well, and to do that convincingly, and to do that in a way that doesn't beg questions and that doesn't, lead people to say, oh, well, you're bringing something in you shouldn't bring in, but rather just to do it in relation to what they themselves are saying and understanding and show forth what they really are saying. To do that work well, that would be great work in relation to our contemporary world, Western world, because it's so dominated by a scientific imagination.
Mm-hmm.
That what you need to do is show it. That's all fine. That's all fine. It's just you're mistaken in thinking that somehow that replaces something else or that somehow that defeats something else. No, in fact, that's not true. And of course, most scientists are not skeptics, right? Most scientists are realists. I mean, they're confident they're understanding the world.
Right.
They're confident there are things out there to understand, and that our mind can grasp these things. And they're not skeptics at all. But they might want to limit what can be known unduly, or not recognize that there is an implication to what they are affirming, and that it's perfectly reasonable and according with reason to draw out those implications. And when you do that, that's the philosophy of nature.
Yeah, so let me ask you this, because part of that divide, or and this does sometimes get brought up when you talk about Thomistic or Aristotelian metaphysics. You already hinted at it, right? Is I think we would argue, in the broad strokes, it seems like, the great Aristotelian Thomistic tradition really seems to have the general outline. It really seems to understand the first principles. The problem was that they seem to have gotten some of the empirical facts wrong, right? Like they may have misunderstood the nature or directedness of certain things. And I think the mistake that is sometimes made that gives the misimpression is because they misunderstood something's nature, therefore they were wrong about their being natures, right?
Yes,
And
that's
not be
that's the tragedy. That when
right.
and I think here I'm just following a long line of Thomistic thinkers, and Maritain certainly would be one of them, and he speaks just this way. When we look at the natural world, we can ask very general questions about it, right? What is change? What was it? Is it change intelligible? It looks like you're getting something from nothing. That makes no sense, right? Because change involves new being. Where'd it come from? From nothing. I mean, how do we understand change? Okay, what's the nature of change? Or, what is time? Very puzzling kind of thing. As Maimonides says somewhere, it's an accident upon an accident, because motion's an accident and time is the accident of motion. So wow, that's hard to figure out. What the heck is that? So we ask kind of basic questions: time, place. Is motion continuous, or is it just little bursts? How do we think about the infinite? Is there such a thing as empty space? What is that? These kinds of questions. So all of those are very, very general questions. Okay, and of course it leads to questions like, well, does change involve agency, and if so, what kind of agency? And that's exactly what Aristotle did in his book called The Physics. These very general questions about nature. Okay, is there a nature? What does it mean to have a nature? But of course, when we look at the natural world, we're not interested just in these general questions. I mean, we really want to understand how those things work. And so he goes on to have many, many further books on plants and animals. And he was a pretty good marine biologist, and he dissected fishes, and, he wanted to see how things work. He wanted to understand. He took chicken embryos and opened a chicken egg at day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5. Each one different, obviously, but to see, well, how does the embryo develop? And so he was fascinated with nature. How does nature work? How does it operate? He wanted to know, right? And he's all of these empirical, specific studies, which are part of his whole physics. Okay. And of course, all of those things are improvable by better studies. Mm-hmm. And in those physical things, he then says things which seem commonsensical, which he hasn't really bothered to test, but he says them. I mean, you can find in his physics things that just seem obvious, like if you drop a heavier object from a tower, it'll hit the ground first. Well, of course. You said, well, did you ever do it?
Right, right.
Well, no, but why should we? It's obvious. Well, actually, it turns out you're wrong. Yeah, what happened in the late medieval and early modern period then was that a lot of these conclusions that had sort of been part of Aristotelian physics or taken as given became questionable. And the biggest one, of course, was that the stars and the sun, they were unchanging, that all of these celestial objects were of a different kind of matter that never passed out of being. The stars were always there, they never changed. There was no change in the sun, there was no change in the orbits. These were all just separate and different kind of thing. And telescopes suggested otherwise. And so you actually find with someone like St. Thomas, who's a Aristotelian, that when it comes to physics, he doesn't have any, he drops all this celestial discussion. It's like, well, maybe that's not true. Well, there were a lot of things in that physics that needed to be, popped with little pins and saying, well, you're wrong, right? I mean, that's just not true. That's, you sort of get Galileo here, right? Okay, well, yeah, okay, to save the phenomenon, we have to say, okay, to save the phenomenon, we have to say that. But he says, yeah, but it does move. Eppure si muove. Yeah, but it does move, right? It's like, come on, it's like, give me a break here. This is what the evidence shows. And in fact, I think that we should say that what we get from microscopes and telescopes is of the same order as what we get without them. Okay, it's a fact. Okay, when people first look through these things, they say, well, maybe the instrument's screwing it all up. And so why should I trust telescopes and microscopes? And so you began to get this, and that's what some of these Aristotelians did, right? That was the wrong move. Yes. So the right move was to say, you're right, a whole bunch of this is revisable. And you're right, he said that and he's wrong. Yeah, and the physics needs to be done better. And you're right, we can do this better by adopting a certain kind of method of empirical investigation. Yes, that does make great sense. He has no problem with that. Let's do it. And if he's wrong, he's wrong. But that doesn't change these general earlier ideas which precede them, really, right? And logically, and which are separable from them. I mean, it still has to be the case that something's changing. It still has to be they move from one place to another. That's because its place in one time, right? It was this, then it's not this. You're not going to get rid of time and place and motion and thinking about what motion is and does it have a cause, and those questions are all the absolutely basic questions which you're actually just assuming are true. You're assuming that things are moving. You're measuring them, right? Well, if they weren't moving, you couldn't measure them. So you've got a whole set of inbuilt assumptions. That are general assumptions, which you think are perfectly reasonable, and I think they're perfectly reasonable, but let's look at them, right? And when you do that, and you don't get rid of all of Aristotle's physics, you only get rid of what accords with empirical analyses that have been surpassed, okay? And so then what you then have to do is, because you are interested in the natural world, you have to try to unite your general understandings of what nature is with all you know about nature on the basis of all the investigations that you have. So empirical science really is something that natural philosophy wants to do because it wants to understand the natural order of things. And so it needs to incorporate all of that stuff. So a Thomistic philosophy of nature now will not look at anything like a Thomistic philosophy in the 14th century, because what we have with empirical science is part of that natural philosophy. It just isn't the only part. And
Yes.
that's the mistake. But trying to show that you can have a general account and then you can unite that general account with all of this specific empirical studies, that's the work. That's the work that has to be done.
Yeah, and I'm really glad we spent time on that, because that seems like a classic case of baby bathwater, tossing it all out, when I think what we should say is that Aristotle, yeah, he got things wrong, right? But within Aristotle, there are the principles for his own correction on many of these.
Oh yeah, I think he would accept this. I think Aristotle understood very well that, and this is true in ethics too, right? When you go from the general down to something more particular, it becomes harder and harder to see what the truth is.
Mm-hmm.
and so you can make mistakes about this, right? And you're not making a mistake about that. So you know, you may make a mistake about slavery being justifiable. He thinks institutional slavery is not justifiable, but that there's a kind of natural servitude. And you could say, well, you're mistaken about that, okay? But you're not mistaken about the nature of justice. Or you're not mistaken about how you have to treat people who are able to think for themselves. I mean, he's thinking there's some people who can't. So you know, you may be wrong about that, or you know, you may be wrong about judicial torture, right? I mean, you may think that's a way to get it, but that may be actually a stupid and mistaken view, which was always held as questionable, even from Augustine on, right? So, but we may be wrong about that, right? But we're not wrong about the wider principle. We just haven't applied it properly. We haven't seen, you know, enough about social reality to come to recognize, yeah, everybody's still right to religion. I mean, these things may indeed take time. These things may indeed be hard to see. Same thing is true with physics, right? You may be completely right about it. You know, what you're saying is the analysis of change, but you've not analyzed this change correctly. Well, that of course I think Aristotle would concede that that's possible, because he sees that as you go from general principles to specific, you become less and less clear, and you need more and more empirical evidence.
So
he's very good about that in the ethics, right? He says, you know, well, we'll just try what we can here, you know. But you could take the same view of the physics, right? We'll do what we can here, because actually, you know, there's a whole lot more we could do. I mean, I think, you know, telescopes and microscopes just widen that out tremendously, you know. And so you got those tools, great. Aristotle would go for it.
yeah, and I guess is kind of, I guess, maybe a wild thought experiment, and there's no way to know what is true. But we could ask, you know, if Aristotle were around today, would he be anything other than an Aristotelian, right? Or if Thomas were around today, would he have changed? Would he suddenly be a physicalist or a naturalist? And of course,
yeah, that's what I'm saying. No, right?
Yeah, no, right?
Yeah.
It just seems obviously no, right?
Yeah. I think Aristotle would say, "Oh, wow, let's do what I think is right," right? Because Aristotle is, you know, I think again, some of these people just don't really realize this. Why are there scientists? Well, because there was Aristotle. Mm-hmm. That's why, you know. Right. Because he's the one philosopher, and in fact, he's really the only philosopher in the ancient world who really wants to understand natural things, right? He is the, you know, so when he says, for example, against later the Stoics, right? Not that he knows them because they're later, but he says, when somebody says that you're happy on the rack, they're talking nonsense, whether they know it or not. And you'd say, well, why talking nonsense, Aristotle? Well, because to be a human being is to be embodied. Okay, no, you're not just a mind, right? You're an animal, and if your animality is being destroyed, then that's by definition not being fulfilled, and so you're not happy, because that's what happiness is, fulfillment. Some part of yourself. You're not just a mind. You're an embodied mind, and that embodiment is you. You're not just this interiority, right? So, you know, here is a man who really does believe that your, you know, DNA matters, that your body actually is you in some way, and that, you know, wants to understand that. And it's because in the high Middle Ages, Aristotle became the philosopher that you got. What did you get? Ultimately, what you got was modern science, because his interest in the natural world was pervasive. People then studied it. People were interested in it. They wanted to understand it. And that, of course, that desire to understand the natural world, that's what the scientist is. He's somebody who wants to understand the natural world. Well, he's an Aristotelian, whether he knows it or not. That's the background to his own interest and his own commitments. It's just that, and it's understandable that this would happen, he doesn't want to do philosophy. You know, philosophers always end up by having impossible arguments and by their headaches, and I don't need it to do my science. To which one should say, amen, brother, you don't. Just go on and do your physics, right? But be sure when you do your physics that you don't turn around and become a scientist, a scientific philosopher, because you've said you're not a philosopher, right? You're doing science. Do it, Right. Yeah, you can do it. That's great. You want to be limited and humble in what you can assert. You're not going to give first principles. Fine. I'm all for it. Let's understand the world as best we can. Right. But don't think that by doing that, you then should say, and all of that's meaningless, or all of that's garbage, or all of that's bad, or all of that blah, blah. No, you have no right to say that. And you don't really want to say it, because if you do, you're going to find yourself with Derrida and Rorty and other people who are saying, well, philosophy is a waste of time. And so, by the way, is science. You don't want to go down that road. I mean, really, an Aristotelian or a Thomist is a natural ally to the scientist.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
The important thing is to recognize that so clearly in the Aristotelian and Thomistic philosophers of today, that they show that forth, that they are able to convince the scientist, because there are always going to be skeptics, and you're always going to find literary types. They always lurk in literature because well, there's an argument between the poet and the philosopher, right? And philosopher really is the scientist. That's why they're a divide, as it were, between these two cultures. But the philosopher bridges that, and can talk to both. But you'll always find people who are skeptical or relativistic, or that's there. That's been a philosophical position. We don't always have to deal with that, but we don't always have to deal with this mistake that has divided empirical science and the philosophy of nature. And if we were able to overcome that, I think we would find ourselves in a very different cultural world.
Yeah, and that's thank you, by the way, for being so generous with your time. This is a deeply fascinating conversation. And if there's two other things I want to ask you about. One is, you mentioned all right, where to begin? So yeah, you said the bridge there, how philosophy provides a bridge. And I think it also provides a bridge, and you talk about this in your book, between the world of the sciences and also the world of religious faith. You have a chapter on the credibility of religious faith. So I want to hang a lantern on that and at least get your thoughts on that, because we talked about before, well, what's the payoff of metaphysics? Like, what's the cash value here, right? What can it actually do for us? And I think that's really important, because we see what the consequences are here if we don't consider it, or we get some things wrong. But what's the potential value there? And then and I guess that ties into your other remark there about how if it were properly appreciated, we might be living in a very different culture as well. And I can't help but wonder if that is part of the problem, right? Is so much of politics and the quest for power presses in on everything, right? So if something can be used in the service of some agenda, I don't think it's hard to imagine the utility of wanting to knock out something like final causality from the world, right? I don't think that, and maybe people just heard us have that hour conversation about final causality, and they're like, well, what is this obscure thing they're talking about? What is the import or significance to this? And I guess what I'm trying to draw out is that actually the significance here can be potentially huge in terms of an entire worldview, in terms of how we answer questions of human meaning, destiny, morality, all of it. So I know I just threw a bunch of stuff your way, and it was pretty jumbled and haphazard, but maybe if you want to pick it apart, however.
Sure, I'll again say two things. First, in relation to the value, because you asked that at the very beginning, what the value of this. There's at some place in the book, I reference what Kant takes to be the three metaphysical questions. Actually, in Aristotelian philosophy, they show up in things that are not just metaphysics. But he says, the three basic questions are the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, freedom of the will. And so I say, well, what would you give to know just three truths? That there is this God, all good, all powerful, that you do have a destiny beyond death because you have an immortal soul. And that destiny depends upon how you choose to use your freedom, because you do have freedom. Mm-hmm. What would you give just to know those three truths? And I would argue you'd give a whole lot. I mean, I could know hundreds and hundreds of truths about snails or hummingbirds. I'd trade them all for those 3 truths.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, easy, right? So, these truths that the philosopher is engaged in, as I say, you're only going to know a few truths about everything that exists, but they go to the heart of our interest and the heart of our desire to understand and to be able to relate our experience meaningfully, because meaning is being able to do that. It's meaningless when you can't make things connect. There's no relation. But meaning comes out of being able to bring these things together. Now, those 3 truths, and perhaps in this respect, the book does have something a bit different from what one sees in other general Thomistic accounts. And if it does, it's because it had its student in mind. Those 3 truths lead to another question, right? Which is, well, how do I get to that end? Or how do I use? Has God's above me, but God's greater than I can't get to God on my own. I can't see God. God's infinite in glory and splendor, and I'm just this creature. I mean, how in the world am I going to reach a place where I could actually know the whole truth, God's whole truth, that I could rejoice in what is good? God is what is good. I mean, that's way beyond me. That's above me, right? And everybody can see that, right? I mean, I can't guarantee that. So if that's going to be possible, right? You talk about bridging gaps. There's the gap that has to be bridged. How do I get from where I am now as an ordinary, rational animal, busy doing the kind of things I'm doing in the 21st century? How do I get from that to this, this possible destiny, right? Well, only if God somehow makes that possible, because he has to bridge the gap. So is there any evidence that God has done that, shown us the way? That's the religious question. Right. So the argument of the book is that philosophy pursuit of the end motivates us to ask, is there any credible way to God? When you ask that question, you could say no, all the religious ways are infantile or questionable or wrong. Or you could say, well, maybe, because I can see how a number of ways seem at least credible. I mean, it's believable, it's plausible, although I personally don't happen to be attracted to any one of them in particular, but it interests me as a study or something. Or you could say, well, I can go a little bit further than that. I mean, I think if your religion is that there is a spaceship hiding behind the moon, and that if you drink certain kind of, I don't know, Kool-Aid, you'll get beamed up to happiness. I think that if that's your religion, that's unreasonable. that's not credible. That doesn't meet the standards of what I consider to be reasonable, but some do, right? And then, or maybe only one does, but in any case, that's something I think, yeah, there is something credible out there. Notice, that's the end. It's just that it's believable.
Right.
But that sets up at least the respect for someone who then goes further and says, and I believe, right? Because then the philosopher can say, well, that's reasonable. He might say, I don't, but he could say, but it's reasonable that you do. And if the believer would then turn around and say, well, how come you don't? Why don't you think this is reasonable? Or he said, well, then he's going to tell his story as a philosopher, and that's going to involve things that get in the way for him. So I'll just be I don't know if this is true or not, but it could be. And I can think of a gardener who I talk with in mind. He was raised a Catholic. I don't think he was practicing any longer. Let's suppose he was. And I then asked him, well, how come you don't hold on to your Catholic faith as something credible? And he said, well, I'm sorry, Michael, but Father Joe abused me as a teenager, and I just can't get past that. Yeah, I'm not going to say that everybody's like that way and so on, but that's just in the way for me. So what he does is, and the reason I mentioned this is actually true. This is a conversation I could have had with this very strapping big young man. Not so young, in his 30s and married and had kids, but he'd been abused. He'd been abused as a teenager by someone who was presumptively supposed to be a shepherd. We've just heard about McCarrick, so it's the reason I mentioned it. I mean, that kind of thing can get in the way for somebody, right? You can say, well, I'm sorry, I just can't give my wholehearted yes to this because, it just doesn't seem to me to be enough. And to take it out of a contemporary point of view, when Jews and Christians had this conversation in the medieval world, right? The typical Jewish kind of take here was, well, wasn't the Messiah supposed to transform the world? Yeah. Well, it doesn't look to me like he has. Why do you think that's the Messiah? Yeah. And especially why do you think that if as a Jew you're being persecuted by a whole bunch of Christians in Spain all the time? So you might have various reasons why, this doesn't work for me. Okay. If you're a philosopher, then I think the answer is it has to be. And that's how the book ends, right? I'm not trying to say you must believe in X. I'm just saying that it motivates the religious question, and that I think that when you look at religion, what you find is that there are a whole bunch of religions that very, very much come close to agreeing about God as the principle of the universe and as that which is absolutely good and the bliss that would make a happiness possible. They just agree about the ways. There's a lot in the ways that are common. They have a common ethic that's the golden rule, but they don't agree about all of the ethic, right? And they obviously have differences. That's very interesting. And that's exactly where a metaphysician wants to go. He wants to ask questions about, well, what is religion and what are the ways that are out there? Because he wants to know, is there anything incredible? But you're not going to get further than that.
Yeah. Right.
As I said, it's like a man or a bride, and there are runaway brides. You get to the altar, and the runaway bride looks at John and says, "John, you're lovable, right? But I'm not going to say I do." Right? Off they run. Yeah. So being credible is not the same thing as saying I do. It's not the same thing as believing, and that story is not the philosophy story. Right? That story is theology, and that's sacred theology, and that story is apologetics. That's a religious tradition then trying to say that this is the invitation. Surely you can see it. Here are the reasons to take it seriously, right? Come and see, come and see. And by the way, that's all that Jesus ever does in the New Testament. Come and see. Come and see, right? So there's the invitation. Knock, right? Well, but what happens after you knock? That's not philosophy, that's theology. Mm-hmm. That's God and you. That's got to do with Holy Spirit touching your heart. That's got to do with the way you respond to that. That's going beyond philosophy.
Yeah.
But I'm arguing then in the book is that philosophy properly pursued in its ultimate reach naturally leads to the conclusion, I have to go beyond myself. I have to go beyond philosophy.
Yes.
And then the only question is, how? Can I? Should I? So I'm arguing then the philosophy motivates us to take religion seriously.
Yeah, and that's wow, what a beautiful and important reflection there, that it makes it credible to continue the search, to continue the hunt, and it can lower these barriers to entry. So many of the barriers to entry that I think we've dealt with, hopefully, throughout the course of this conversation, and there's many cultural contemporary barriers to entry, and that the payoff of metaphysics is it can lend credibility to the religious hunt, the search, and the question. At which point we I think, yes, right, we want to admit that philosophy can extend so far, but only so far, just as we've been arguing that science can extend so far, but only so far. I want to get your final remarks here, Dr. Torre. This has been a fantastic conversation. I do want to let people know, if nothing else, is a thank you for Dr. Torre of giving us so much of his time. I'm going to buy 2 extra copies of this, and we're going to give them away to some listeners. How will you win one? Well, just do me a favor and just buy a copy yourself. And if you win one, then you already have something to give a relative for Christmas. You can leave a comment. How about that? You leave a comment, a thoughtful comment that you made it to the end of this episode, wherever you're watching or listening. I'll pick some people at random, and I'm going to send you a copy of this excellent book. Dr. Torre, final thoughts on this? Anything else you want to let people know about the metaphysical project in general, or what else to expect from your book? And then where's the best place to grab a copy?
You probably know that question better than I do. I don't really know where the best place to grab it is.
I can tell them. Yeah, it's Scepter. It's the publisher's website. So it would be Scepter publishing.org. I'll link it in the show notes so for easy access. But yeah,
I think that's probably the best and most secure place to get it. I think just the final thought here, actually, again, picking up on something you said, and actually going back to the very beginning of the book. What metaphysics gives us, I think, when it's properly engaged, or put it this way, what I take to be the take-home value of the Thomistic physics that I'm trying to be a faithful instrument of in the book, is indeed only, as it were, an outline. That is to say, it gives something. It gives some sense to our, there is a world, we do know it, there are things in it, they are of different degrees, we can understand them to some extent, and yes, they only exist by virtue of a cause behind the universe that is wondrous and glorious, and is what accounts for the fact there's a universe at all. That we're on the way to that because that's what we want. We want to know that. We want to know the truth, and we want to know, therefore, our maker. It gives us this, as it were, very general outline. But metaphysics, in doing so, opens up all sorts of further questions that all have to be continually explored. And you'll never come to an end to it. You'll never come to an end to thinking about what really knowledge is and what are the conditions for knowing. And you'll never come to an end to thinking about how do we talk about the human animal as both a knower and an animal, the relationship between the brain and the mind. We're not going to come to an end in thinking about the good and the degrees of good. We're not going to come to an end in terms of what nature gives us and all the kind of puzzles that, let's say, quantum mechanics or whatever you run across in contemporary physics or even mathematics might pose for our thinking. That these are all further explorations, further hard questions. That's the nature of philosophy. In the Meno, Socrates talks with a slave boy, and he asks him, how do you double the area of a square? Right, it's 2 by 2, and that's 4. So how do you get the area to be 8? Okay, well, first the slave boy doubles the sides, but that's 4 by 4 and it's 16, so 4 is no good. So I think, well, it's 3. Well, 3 by 3 is 9, and that's no good. Then he doesn't know how to do it. It's between 2 and 3, and he's stuck. Okay, and Socrates says, well, here's how you do it, and he takes the diagonal, and he shows the slave boy, see, if you construct a square off the diagonal, that's going to end up by being double the area. And the slave boy sees that. And so in the Meno, he answers this question. How do you double the area of the square? Off of the diagonal. But note, there's another question lurking there. What's the value of the diagonal? Turns out to be 2 times the square root of 2, or it's the square root of 8. Well, what's the square? What is that? You know, and he doesn't answer that question. It motivates that question, and that question doesn't get answered. And I think that that's the nature of philosophy. Philosophy always will answer one question. If it does a good job of it, and it's reasonable, and you can see that makes sense, it goes on. There's another question, right? We've been doing this in our conversation, right? Okay, so, well, I can see that living things have final causality, but he says that's true of all things. How is that true of non-living things? Motivates that question, right? Those are just ways that Thomas gives us. They're not fully developed arguments. And even when you get a fully developed argument, the conclusion of it is going to lead you to ask another question. And that's the nature of human being. We're pilgrims on the way. We're not at our end. We don't fully understand. So I don't want anybody to take away from a book like this anything other than a recognition of this constant truth about the human condition, which is that we're knowers that don't know, right? We do know, but we don't know. And to end then where the whole thing begins, with God. For Thomas, you know, we don't know what God is. You know, what is God? Thomas, when he was a little boy, asked that question. What is God? He didn't ask who is God, because he knew who God was, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. But what is God? Right? Good philosophical question, right? And his answer, 40 or 50 years later before he dies, or his answer throughout his life is, we don't know what God is. I don't know what God is. You don't know what God is. We can't define God. We can't get our minds around God. He goes even further, right? And it's classic to his philosophical tradition, right? He says, you can see God face to face. He's right in front of you just the way you are in front of me on this screen, right? I see you face to face, and I'll never comprehend you. Mm-hmm. I'll never get my mind around God, right? God's incomprehensible. I can know God, but he's too great to comprehend. Right? I'm just a finite human being. You know, when we get to God, when we get to the source of the universe, we get to something very mysterious, something that we always have to be saying, well, not like that. No, not like that. No, he's not like that. No, he's not a bearded. No, that's wrong. No. But you don't want to, it's not just negative. If it were negative, we'd end up being agnostics. But Thomas is closer to being an agnostic than he is to being somebody who believes in stories that are literally true. You know, Socrates said to Euthyphro, you believe those stories, Euthyphro? And, you know, yeah, no, we shouldn't take them literally, right? So, you know, the very first thing he says is God is not a body, right? You know, no, he's not. No, God's not like us. So, and John says, you know, God is pure spirit. So he's got warrant for saying this in his tradition, but in his own metaphysics, that's getting underlined. That's what the intellectual, and he is one, gives his religious tradition. He's not alone in this. Maimonides does the same for the Jewish, Averroes for the Muslim, right? But what he does for his, and what many philosophers do for their tradition, is to make us recognize how small our idea of God may be. God we think we don't believe in, you know, Thomas would say, well, I don't believe in that either. But that's not God. You know, of course, let's get rid of that, right? So I think a lot of people who say, you know, well, I don't believe in God, you know, you ask them, what do you, when you say you not believe in God, what is the God you don't believe in? And when they tell you, then you can say, well, I don't believe in that God either.
Yeah, you and me both.
Yes, that's like, so, you know, yes, I hope that the book motivates people to become more thoughtful in their approach to an adult approach to what it is to affirm the existence of God, and more thoughtful in their approach to religion, just as they can be more thoughtful in their approach to science. And that, I guess that was ultimately what I hope for my students, that coming into a class, not believing in, you could know much about any of these things and not believing in God and thinking that's kind of silly and everybody doesn't know. And, they had all these ideas that they could disabuse themselves of some of them. And they would disabuse themselves of some of them by saying, oh, you know what? I don't believe that. I really don't believe that, do I? Yeah, actually, no, I think about it. That I've been fooling myself with this slogan. It's the way what I myself really think.
Right.
Because I do think that what we all really think is that the universe did not pop into existence from nothing. That makes no sense. Therefore, there has to be a source. And I think that most people, when they recognize that, also recognize how different that source is from everything else, to the point where they want to say, gee, well, what can we say about it? And the book is saying, well, not too much. It's true, but something.
But something.
Not
right.
not nothing. It's not a black hole. That's not right. That's going back to thinking it's coming from nothing. Well, that's not right. So, there are some few things that can be said about this. And actually, I think that the religious point of view corresponds with this philosophical point of view. And this philosophical point of view really is finally, at some level, optimistic, right? I mean, well, the first word and the last word is with existence. Like, hey, I'm part of the show. Wow, right? And it's the first word is with goodness, and behind everything is generosity. Everything exists because this generous donation of existence to me. Wow, right? It's good, right? The fundamental thing, despite the horrors of the world, and despite how we managed to make a horror of it, no, the fundamental thing that has to be said is, order is greater than disorder, being is greater than nothing, goodness is greater than evil. Behind and everything that we experience lies this hope, and you cannot quench it from the human heart. And I don't care if you're Epicurus and say you're going to root this out of your heart. No, you're not. Right? This is part of our very nature, to aspire to hope for a reality, a greatness, a goodness that we can see there. It's intimated. So, I think that the book wants us to, I want us through the book to believe in that intimation.
Yes,
not to believe in it as a religious truth, to see it that it is in fact our human condition. Right?
Yes.
It's not all bad. Not all bad.
Yeah, fantastic. It reminds me of another atheist who became Catholic. He might be an acquaintance of yours, Dr. J. Budziewski, right? In his book, What We Can't Not Know. I think that's exactly what you're talking about. It's what we can't not know. We can act like we don't know it. We can kind of indoctrinate ourselves out of it, but deep down, it's what we can't not know. I think that is a
there's no atheists in foxholes, and there's no atheists when the plane's going down, right? And it's only in your heart the fool says there is no God, right? You're only a fool if you say it in your heart. You can say it in your head a lot, but in your heart, that you're only a fool if you do that, right? And why is it that there's no atheist in the foxhole when the plane's going down? Because God's the only one who can help me, right? I mean, so and is that something I've given up on? You know what? No, I haven't. So I think that that's reasonable. So if somebody claims that we're being unto death, and you can find philosophers who will say things like that. The answer is that's wrong. Of course, we are being unto death in one sense because we're all going to die, and yeah, that is true. But there is a hope of something undying in us, and you're not going to get rid of it. And the book is saying, and you shouldn't think that you're just some sort of naive, gullible person for having that hope. On the contrary, you are really responding to what is reasonable. You are seeing it the way it in fact is. So to hope beyond hope, to find a way past the horrors of the 20th century, and the horrors that possibly await us. This is something we cannot dim from us, and we should not want to dim from us. And that's the, and it's reasonable not to want to dim that. Okay, that's what the book fundamentally is saying at the end, where it's saying, you know, we have to examine religious ways as being credible, as it's possible, right? So that possibility is there, and we should take it seriously. And yeah, so I kind of hope maybe it does to some degree speak to this divide between science and religion, or between people who are skeptical about religious claims and those who aren't. And that's all part of our culture today. So that kind of was, I guess, the final thing. You know, take hope. Take hope that there is grounds for hope.
The book is What Is? Introductory Reflections on Thomistic Metaphysics. I cannot recommend it highly enough. Head over to Scepter Publishers. That's Scepter, SCEPTER Publishers.org. I'll link it in the show notes. I'm going to buy 2 extra copies. Leave a comment. Let me know what you thought of this conversation. I'll pick somebody to win a copy. Dr. Michael Torre, another fantastic conversation. I've been wanting to do an introductory episode on philosophy metaphysics. I can't think of somebody better to have done it with. So thank you so much for giving us your time today.
Great pleasure to talk with you, Pat, always. Either you know, with somebody else listening in or not. Okay, so I look forward to our continued conversations.